Duke Alaric Voss had worn the same gold ring for 11 years. It was not on his left hand, where a married man would wear it. It was on his right hand, close to his heart, as he liked to say whenever someone was brave enough to ask. Most people did not ask twice. There was something about the quiet look in his eyes that told them not to. The people of Ashfield had their own stories about the ring. Some said he had loved a woman who died before their wedding day. Others said he had once been secretly married, and his wife had left him in shame. The servants whispered new versions of the tale every year, and every year, the Duke let them whisper. He never corrected them. It was easier to let people believe a story than to explain the truth. The truth was something he had not spoken aloud in 11 years. Ashfield House stood at the edge of a wide green valley, with tall windows that looked out over fields, and a long stone path leading to the front doors. It was a grand house, but in recent years it had grown quiet. The Duke spent his days working through papers in his study, riding alone across his land, and avoiding the parties his mother tried to arrange for him. He was 34 years old, unmarried, and, according to everyone who knew him, completely unwilling to change that. It was on a cold autumn morning that Marian Hale arrived at Ashfield House. She came not as a guest, but as the new steward of the estate, hired to manage the household accounts after the previous steward had left the books in terrible disorder. Marian was 29 years old, a widow, and not the kind of woman who cared what people thought of her plain traveling dress or her direct way of speaking. She had lost her husband 2 years earlier to a long illness, and after his death, she had discovered that managing money was something she was very good at. She needed steady work, not pity, and the position at Ashfield paid well enough to make the long journey worth it. When she stepped out of the carriage, the first thing she noticed about the Duke was not his title or his serious face. It was the ring on his right hand, gleaming faintly in the morning light as he reached out to greet her. "Mrs. Hale," he said, "welcome to Ashfield." "Your Grace," she replied, with a small, polite bow of her head. She did not smile too widely, and she did not look away nervously, the way she imagined other young women might. She simply studied him for a moment, the way she studied a column of numbers before deciding whether it was correct. He noticed the look. Most people who came to Ashfield either stared at the ring with open curiosity or pretended very hard not to look at it at all. Marian did neither. She looked at it once, the way she might look at any small detail, and then she looked away, as if it were none of her business. It was a strange relief. The first weeks were filled with work. Marian spent long hours in the estate office, going through ledgers that had not been balanced properly in years. She found mistakes, missing payments, and several debts that no one in the house seemed to know about. She brought each problem to the Duke clearly, and without softening her words, which surprised him. Most people who worked for him were too afraid to point out his mistakes, even when the mistakes were not his own. "This entry is wrong," she told him one afternoon, pointing to a page in the account book. "Someone has been taking money meant for the tenant farms and putting it towards something else entirely." The Duke looked over her shoulder at the numbers. "Are you certain?" "I am always certain when it comes to numbers," she said. "It is people I am less certain about." He almost smiled at that. It had been a long time since anyone in his household had spoken to him so plainly. As the weeks passed, the Dowager Duchess, Alaric's mother, began to take a special interest in Marian's presence. Eleanor had spent years trying to convince her son to remarry, certain that the right woman could finally pull him out of the quiet sadness he had carried since his sister's death. She did not know the full truth about the ring either, only that Alaric had begun wearing it the year Cordelia died, and that he had never explained why. "She is clever," Eleanor said to her son one evening, after Marian had left the room, "and she does not flatter you the way the other young ladies do." She is the estate steward, mother, Alaric said. Nothing more. For now, Eleanor said, with a small, knowing smile. Alaric ignored her. He told himself that his mother's hopes were nothing more than an old woman's wishful thinking, but he found himself, more and more often, looking forward to the moments when Marian would knock on his study door with a new problem to solve. One evening, as autumn turned colder and the fields outside grew gray with frost, Marian found Alaric sitting alone in the library, staring at the fire instead of the papers in front of him. She had come to ask him about a payment due to the local mill, but the question died on her lips when she saw his face. "You look troubled," she said simply. "It is nothing," he said, the way he always said it. Marian sat down across from him without being invited, which no one else in the house would have dared to do. "My husband used to say that to me too," she said, right before he told me the thing that was bothering him most. Alaric looked at her for a long moment. There was something about the quiet steadiness in her voice that made him want to speak, even though he had trained himself for years not to. "It is the date," he said finally. 11 years ago today, my sister died." Marian did not say she was sorry, the way most people would have. She simply waited, giving him room to continue if he wished. "Her name was Cordelia," he said. "She was 19. Our father had died only months before, and the estate was in chaos. I was 23, suddenly responsible for everything, and I had no idea what I was doing. Then Cordelia became ill, and within a few months, she was gone too. That is a great deal of loss for one young man to carry," Marian said. "I did not carry it well," Alaric admitted. "I was angry and tired and frightened, and I let it make me hard. Cordelia saw that happening, even as she was dying. She told me she was afraid I would become like our father, a man who cared more about duty than about the people in front of him." He turned the ring slowly on his finger as he spoke. "In her final days, she gave me this ring. It had belonged to our grandmother. She made me promise that I would not let grief and duty turn me into a man who could never love anyone again. I made the promise to comfort her, because she was dying and frightened, and I would have promised her anything in that moment. And you have kept it on ever since," Marian said softly. "I told myself I was keeping my promise," Alaric said, "but the truth is, I think I have been hiding behind it. As long as I wear the ring, I do not have to risk loving anyone and losing them, the way I lost my father and my sister in the same terrible year. It is easier to let people believe I am mourning a wife who never existed than to admit I have been too afraid to live the life Cordelia asked me to live." The fire crackled in the silence that followed. Marian considered his words carefully before she spoke again. "My husband was sick for 3 years before he died," she said. "Everyone around me expected me to grieve in a certain way, to wear black for a certain length of time, to cry at the right moments, and be strong at others. But grief did not work that way for me. Some days I missed him terribly. Other days I simply had bills to pay and meals to cook, and grief had no time to visit at all. I think people expect sorrow to look like a performance, when really it is just a quiet thing that lives inside a person, taking whatever shape it needs to take." "You think I have made my grief into a performance," Alaric said. "I think you have made your promise into a prison," Marian said. "Your sister did not ask you to wear a ring forever and refuse all happiness. She asked you to make sure that when you did love someone, it would be real, not simply duty wearing a different coat. The ring was never supposed to stop you from living. It was supposed to remind you to live honestly." Alaric stared at her, struck by how clearly she had understood something he had spent 11 years failing to see for himself. "You are the first person who has ever asked what the ring actually meant," he said. Everyone else only wanted to know who the woman was. "I am not interested in imaginary women," Marian said, with the faintest hint of a smile. "I am interested in the truth." After that evening, something between them began to shift, slowly and quietly, the way frost creeps over a field overnight. They continued to work together on the estate accounts, but their conversations stretched longer than they needed to. Alaric found himself asking Marian's opinion not only on numbers, but on decisions about the tenants, the house, and even his own family. Marian, who had sworn after her husband's death that she would never again let herself depend on anyone, found that she looked forward to their meetings more than she wanted to admit. But not everyone in the house was pleased. Word spread among the staff and, eventually, among the neighboring families, that the Duke spent an unusual amount of time with his steward. Some called it improper. A widow, however clever, was still far beneath a duke in rank, and tongues began to wag about what exactly was happening behind the closed door of the estate office. The Dowager Duchess, who had once hoped Marian might be good for her son, grew worried when she heard the rumors reaching as far as London. She had always imagined her son marrying someone of equal rank, someone who could bring connections and security to the family name. A steward, no matter how clever, was not the match she had pictured. "People are talking," Eleanor said to Alaric one morning, her voice tight with concern, "about you and Mrs. Hale." "Let them talk," Alaric said. "It is not so simple," Eleanor said. "You are a duke. Your choices affect this entire family, not just yourself." "For 11 years, I have made every choice based on what was expected of me," Alaric said. "I kept this house in order. I managed every duty placed upon me. And in all that time, I forgot what it meant to choose something simply because it was right, rather than because it was expected." Eleanor opened her mouth to argue, but something in her son's face stopped her. She had not seen him speak with such certainty in years. That same week, Alaric finally went to see Mr. Pruitt, the old family solicitor who had managed the Voss family's affairs since before Alaric was born. Pruitt was the only living person who knew the full truth about Cordelia's final days and the promise she had asked her brother to make. "You look like a man who has finally remembered something important," Pruitt said, when Alaric explained why he had come. "I think I have spent 11 years honoring my sister's memory in the wrong way," Alaric said. "I wore the ring to remind myself of my promise, but somewhere along the way, the ring became the promise itself, instead of simply a symbol of it." "Your sister loved you very much," Pruitt said gently. "I do not believe she meant for her ring to become a wall around your heart." Alaric nodded slowly, understanding settling over him like the first light of morning. A few days later, Alaric asked Marian to walk with him through the gardens behind Ashfield House. The frost had melted from the grass, and a pale winter sun was shining over the bare trees. Marian agreed, though she could see from his expression that something important was on his mind. "I have spent a great deal of time thinking about what you said," Alaric began, as they walked along the stone path. "About the ring being a prison rather than a promise." "And what have you decided?" Marian asked. Alaric stopped walking and turned to face her. Slowly, he slipped the ring from his right hand, the first time it had left his finger in 11 years. He held it carefully in his palm, looking at it for a long moment before looking back up at her. "I am not removing this because I have forgotten my sister, or because I no longer honor the promise I made to her," he said. "I am removing it because I finally understand what she truly asked of me. She did not want me to spend my life alone, protected by grief. She wanted me to live honestly and to love someone for the right reasons, not simply because it was expected of me, and not as an escape from loneliness either." He reached into his coat pocket and pulled out a thin gold chain. Carefully, he slid Cordelia's ring onto the chain, so that it could be worn close to his heart in a different way, no longer a barrier, but a quiet reminder. "Marian," he said, "I am not offering you a title, or wealth, or the comfort of an easy life, because I do not think those things are what either of us truly wants. I am asking you to let me love you honestly, the way my sister hoped I would one day love someone. Not out of duty, not out of loneliness, simply because, for the first time in 11 years, I have found someone who understands exactly why I wore that ring, and exactly why I am ready to set it down." Marian was quiet for a long moment, her eyes moving from the ring on its chain to the man standing before her, more open and unguarded than she had ever seen him. "I did not come to Ashfield looking for love," she said finally. "I came looking for steady work and a quiet life. After losing a husband I dearly loved, I promised myself I would not let my heart depend on anyone again." "I understand if that promise still stands," Alaric said quietly. "It did stand," Marian said, "until I met a man who did not ask me to perform my grief for his comfort, and who did not ask me to forget my husband in order to be cared for. You have never once asked me to be anyone other than exactly who I am." She reached out and took his hand, the one that had worn the ring for so many years, now bare and waiting. "I am not interested in titles or duty either," she said, "but I am interested in honesty, and if you are offering that, then yes, I am willing to set aside my own fear, the same way you have set aside yours." That evening, when Alaric finally told his mother and the household the full truth about the ring, no one was disappointed by the absence of a tragic lost bride. Instead, the staff found themselves quietly moved by the story of a frightened young man and his dying sister, and by the promise that had taken 11 long years to be understood correctly. The Dowager Duchess, who had once worried so much about rank and reputation, found that her worries faded the moment she saw the calm happiness on her son's face, a happiness she had not seen since long before Cordelia's death. Ashfield House, which had grown so quiet over the years, began to feel different. The fields outside still turned cold every winter, and grief, as Marian had once said, never disappeared entirely. But it no longer stood guard over every door in the house. Alaric still wore Cordelia's ring close to his heart, on its chain beneath his coat, but it was no longer a wall keeping the world out. It had finally become exactly what his sister had always intended it to be, not a prison, but a quiet, steady reminder to live honestly and to love without fear.